Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 2, Halacha 4, in the Art Scroll 16a1. This sounds like it's going to be a hard Mishnah and a hard Gemara, but it's quite simple. We're talking about, and it says, your field you shall not sow in a mixture of seeds. That means that you can't sow with different species in a way that's going to be mixed up together. Now, we were looking in the past couple of halachas where what happens if you're mingling the seeds in the same space, if it's in the same field? Well, we see that there's a problem. You have to plow it first. Now, over here, we're going to want to make different rows of seeds, but we want to have different ones next to each other. Now, there's two things happening here. The Torah law says you shall not sow a mixture of seeds. That means that you can't have different species in the same space. So it means that you can have a separation. The question is going to be, how far is this separation going to be? Then there's going to be a D'Rabbanan issue. The D'Rabbanan issue is going to be that you have to make sure that it's obvious to everyone else that there's no Maris Ein issue, that you've dafka, definitely with intention, tried to do different strips of different plants next to each other. So again, in this case, you want to have a field with different plants and you want to create planting strips. In the last halacha, we were just saying, okay, all the land, we're going to plant it with wheat, and then, we change our mind, we're going to plant it with barley. What do, right? Well, you can't do that because you'd have a mixture inside of it. And also in the last halacha, what happens if you have the fenugreek and now you have some of these beneficial grasses in there? That's going to be a Kilayim issue because you want the grasses to help the growth of it. And we saw yesterday in the Bavli is going to be saying that up to 1/24th, it's not going to be considered Kilayim because, again, it's not really a mixture, even though you're going to be getting benefit from it. Now, over here, you want to create different furrows of different plants. What's going to be the rule on that? And you have this Maris Ein issue that you have to give the appearance that you have two really different rows of different plants. And how do you show that you haven't violated this mixture law that the Torah has? You have to create spacing. Now, I would have thought that if you want to have a row A and a row B and a row C, and row A and row B and row C have three different types of crops next to it, what would you, very close to it, what would you be doing? How far would this spacing be? And I would have thought that the space between these three rows would have to be equidistant. In other words, that if you had, let's say, a 2.5 almost space gap between row A and row B and between B and C, that from the start of the row to the end of the row, that you would have the same 2.5 almost distance throughout it. That's not going to be the case. So what they're going to be arguing over here is that you're going to have this gap, but it can taper at the ends. So as long as part of the row, like the middle part of the row, has this, let's say, for example, 2 almost gap, right? As it can taper back. So that why can you taper it back? Because you have a visual indicator that you didn't sow them next to each other inside the same space. And you have a visual indicator that you're doing something a little bit goofy as to show, because it's really not the most efficient way to do farming, right? They're trying to teach this to you so that if you are going to be planting two things next to each other, you're going to know how to do it. It's not a recommendation on how to do it. All it's trying to do is say that if you had a garden and you were planting two rows next to each other, how can you do it? In the way that the Mishnah is talking about, it's going to maximize how much yield you can get. That's one of the sub-themes always, all the books of planting and farming and things like that. You always want to maximize yield. So if you have a strip in strip A and it's going to be tapering off and it's going to get in the middle like this big separation, and then it tapers off again at the top end of the field. So what effectively happened is inside of your strip, you've maximized the amount that you can grow. But again, there is going to be separation. Now, again, this is going to be trying to solve two things. A Maris Ayin issue, which is going to probably be D'Rabbanan, although there are some Rishonim who say that it's actually D'Oraita, but most of the Rishonim say it's a D'Rabbanan issue. And then you have the D'Oraita thing of not mixing the seeds inside of the same part of the space of the field. So you have to give the appearance that you're not trying to show two different things in the field. So you have to do two things at the same time. And that's what this Gemara and Mishnah is going to be about. So this is going to cover if you want to plant within several strips, and each strip is going to have different species. How do you do it? And the Mishnah says if someone wishes to make his field into separate strips, each planted with a different species, Bet Shammai says a gap the size of 3 ground-breaking furrows must separate between the strips. And Bet Hillel says the strips must be separated by the width of the yoke used in Sharon. Now, you say to yourself, what does that mean? Okay, I want to point out, one of the Meforshim are going to be saying, why is it talking about the yoke used in Sharon? Because that's a standard yoke that everybody would know in the lowland fields, right? We're not talking about highlands around Jerusalem that are mountainous and rocky. We're talking about the lowland area that's flat. And they used a very efficient kind of yoke to do that kind of easy to plow, not rocky field. Very easy, very full of dirt. That's where they're still planting crops today, like for barley and wheat. And when you go on the highway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, you can see that. So we're talking about something that would be a standard size back in the day. And this is basically going to be written so that the person who doesn't know that much, if they're looking at the Mishnah, it's going to be very easy for them to understand, because if they're trying to go by measurements with amot and things like that, it might be complicated for them. But the reason the Mishnah uses this language is to make it easy for people to understand without having to measure it. That's why this is here. Now, I want to pull out another thing that, in fact, the difference between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel is almost negligible. It's almost actually almost about the same size. Bet Shammai is a tiny bit bigger, but it's a fraction bigger. It is almost the same thing. Again, what both of these are saying, they're both saying that you have to create a noticeably distinct strip that's going to give the appearance that you're not mingling these different seeds, and that you have this visual indicator that you don't have the intention to mix seeds. Biblically, for Kilayim, it's going to be violated only if 2 species are sown simultaneously. Now, the requirement that the species be noticeably distinct, that's going to be a rabbinic origin. Now, the Rambam is going to be saying that the stipulation of simultaneous planting applies to only Kilei Karam, and that the prohibition of Kilei Zerayim applies even if the species are not planted simultaneously. And the Chazan Ish in his Kilayim book in 210 is saying that it is a biblical requirement that species be noticeably distinct. So again, the Rambam is saying that only for Kilei Karam with vineyards does it have to be visibly distinct, and for the Kilei Zerayim, that's not going to be the case. The Chazan Ish is going to be saying that it is going to be actually a biblical requirement that the species be noticeably distinct. So the answer is you do have to make it noticeably distinct. The exact mechanism and reason why you do, well, that's going to be a maloket, as you can see. But there are other opinions about this, and they argue whether this visual distinction for Kilei Zerayim is going to be D'Oraita or is going to be D'Rabbanan. And the idea that's coming up here between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel is that these groundbreaking furrows are going to be furrows made by the first plowing of the season after the last season's harvest. And these are going to be more widely spaced than the furrows of the rain that we saw in chapter 2, Halacha 2, where we're talking about over there when you have the first rain and then you're trying to break up the field and try to get the water into the field. So this is going to be the widest, easiest kind of plowing to sort of start breaking up the land and to make it easier in successive growths to be planting. And what about this yoke of Sharon? Well, the Gemara is going to be talking about the measure of 3 ground breaking furrows and the yoke used in Sharon in terms of amot. And the Mishnah is giving the measure in terms of furrows and a yoke because these are easy for a farmer to understand. And not every farmer is going to be able to get how to deal with the amot if you're going to be dealing with amot. So the Gemara is going to be dealing with amot, and the Mishnah is going to be easier for a farmer to understand, where he'll look at it in terms of furrows and be able to get it. The Gemara, the Mishnah says, and the words of these are close to being like the words of those. In other words, the opinion of Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai are nearly identical. And Bet Shammai's requirement of 3 ground-breaking furrows is only slightly larger than Bet Hillel's requirement of the width of the yoke used in Sharon. It's almost the same. The Gemara now is actually going to get into this measurement of the amot, but I wanted to point out the interestingness of it, where the Mishnah doesn't use it in terms of amot. The Gemara does, and why it is. Because, again, we're concerned that the farmer is going to look at the halacha and not be able to perform it. We want to make it simple for him to do. The Gemara is going to give the technical thing on how it is and give the technical measurements. Rabbi Zera says in the name of Rabbi Lazar, says in the name of Rabbi Chia the Great, that he must make the gaps between the strips 2 amot by 2 amot in one place, and then he may continuously narrow the gaps until the measure is only the slightest, smallest amount at the end of the field. Again, we have to have where the middle part is going to be this 2 amot difference, this 2 amot by 2 amot square or rectangle difference, okay? That's how wide it has to be from strip A to strip B, from strip B to strip C, from strip C to strip D. You have to make this visual indicator. Is this going to be D'Rabbanan or D'Oraita for why you have to do it? I'm not sure. Even the Maforshim argue on it. But you have to do it. And the interesting part is, again, we would have thought, okay, well, we have to keep this gap the same throughout this field. In fact, you don't. Why? Because you've already shown that you haven't done it by making this awkward sort of gap between row A and row B. And then you can taper it off. Again, that's going to be because the Torah is always concerned for the money of Israel. This is a way to maximize the yield if you are doing this in terms of the farmer. So it maximizes the amount of money he's going to be doing if he's following the halacha to separate row A from row B with 2 different crops, and also giving the visual distinction for anybody who walks by and sees this weird sort of gap. So again, you have this middle gap. It has to be 2 amos by 2 amos in that strip, separating between strip 1 and strip 2, and then it can taper off. And so you have to imagine that it's going to be like a box. It's going to be like a square in the middle of this field that's going to be 2 amos by 2 amos before it starts to taper. And that's going to give you a way that you satisfy the halacha and you still get the most efficient way to do strip A with 1 crop, strip B with a 2nd crop, and still not be holding or maintaining Kilayim and not be violating any of the tachanas if they are in fact going to be D'Rabbanan, and also making sure that you're keeping all of the Torah that's going to be D'Oraita as well. So there's going to be an argument about Rabbi Chia the Great and Rebbe. That there's going to be an argument about really how do they look at where this location of 2 by 2 is. And again, the opinion of Rabbi Chia the Great is going to be this 2 amot by 2 amot position is going to be in one place, probably the middle. That's the most efficient way to do it. And then it can go and taper off to a strip. Everybody agrees it can taper off to a strip. Now, Rabbi Yonah is going to specify the applicability of the Mishnah's leniency that strips containing different species only need to be separated by 2 amot. And Rabbi Yonah said this leniency was stated with regard to a field that was made into several strips, but if it was made only to 1 strip adjacent to a complete field, this is not going to be subject to the leniency. So what Rabbi Yonah is doing, he's qualifying this. So this rule is only going to be if you have many strips. You have strip A, strip B, strip C. If you have strip A and strip B, you're going to need greater than that amount, says Rabbi Yonah, to make this separation, okay? Because effectively, you're creating, in a way, like two different fields, right? So you're going to need a greater amount. But if you're doing it with strips, with each strip having one type of crop in it, and then going on to another strip with another crop, and then another one with another crop, then you're going to be getting into this pattern where it's going to be 2 by 2 in the middle as a box, and then taper off toward the ends of the rows, and that is going to maximize the yield if you are doing this kind of configuration. This, by the way, can make sense if you are going to be farming like vegetables in a garden. So if you have a row of tomatoes over here, and then you have a row of cucumbers over there, and then you're going to have a row of squash over here, and a row of peppers over there. Well, that's how you can get several strips occurring in a garden. And you wouldn't be doing this kind of thing if you were trying to, be a wheat farmer. You would never do this. But if you had a plot of land and you were trying to grow some garden vegetables for yourself and your family, then yeah, you probably need to know this. Now, this Gemara is talking about the ruling that's going to go with what we're talking about with Rabbi Chia the Great. And again, this whole subtext of the Gemara is ultimately going to be a difference in agreement and measurement between Rabbi Chia the Great and Rebbe. There's a slight disagreement, but the basics are the same, right? They all say that there has to be a gap. The question is going to be, how wide is this gap going to be? So this ruling of Rabbi Chia the Great, says this Gemara, that only one end of the gap need measure 2 amos, but the rest of the gap may narrow until it is the minimal size of the other end, accords with that which was stated by Rabbi Yanai, who said, I am able to plant in my field 50 different species, and 25 from here on one side, and 25 from here on the other side. In other words, Rabbi Yanai is confirming that his field is 50 amot long and 50 amot wide. And Rabbi Kanievsky says about this that in this kind of measurement of Rabbi Yanai's field, for like say his garden vegetables, on each side of the field, Rabbi Yanai can plant 25 adjoining strips, and the 23 middle strips on each side would be 2 1/12 amos wide, and at the end of the field, it would be narrow to a point, and in the middle of the field, and then the 2 strips at the end of each side would narrow to 1 1/24 amot at the edges, and this would allow a space measuring 2 amos by 2 amos, and then he would be able to pull this off. So again, if you have it where this is a little bit hard to explain, but let's say you have a 50 amos field by 50 amos field. Okay, in the middle of the field, on each of these strips, you're going to have this like tiger pattern going on, where they're going to be going like up to this box of 2 amos by 2 amos, and then in the middle, and then it tapers off from then to the end of the field. So basically what they're saying is the last row on each side, that's going to be 1 1/24, but the rest of the rows are going to be the standard size. The only 2 rows at the end, the last row on the top end and the last row on the bottom end, these are going to be where you make up the difference to get this and fit everything in. And this confirms the position of Rabbi Chia the Great, effectively. And this is how you can grow lots of different things in your garden and still have it fit the halacha and maximize your yields. So the Gemara is going to extend the scope of the ruling of the Mishnah. It says one may have such a small separation between the 2 fields that are made into strips, and accordingly, even between his field and the field of his fellow that is planted in strips, it's permitted to plant another species with such a small separation from the main crop. So in the middle of this strip, you have many strips going, and you're growing many things in this garden. And in the middle of the field, you have this 2 amos by 2 amos box, and then that's the gap. And then this gap, it tapers off onto each end and basically narrows, so that as the gap is narrowing, you can plant more things in the part that is filling in the space that was narrowing. So this is a way that in each of the strip, it's going to fill in so you can get the most out of this as possible. Now, this is basically going to be a geometry problem, and this is always a geometry problem as a farmer. You want to take the piece of land you have and figure out how to sow on it so that you've maximized all of the nutrition that you're going to be allocating to it, plus all of the space and all of the area to make sure that you get the most out of it. And so in terms of density of how you're planting it, and in terms of separating between this field and that field, or in this case between strip A, strip B, and strip C, so you get the most yield at the end when you harvest it. Because again, the Torah is always concerned for the money of Am Yisrael and wants to give the halacha in a way that's going to maximize your yield, but still going to make sure that you're not going to be violating a Torah law, like not to mix the things from strip A and strip B and have it mix into each other. So the Gemara is going to give another ruling in a similar case, and the Gemara says the same applies to the case of a destroyed field, and if one's field is going to be planted in strips, it's going to be permitted to maintain another strip remaining from a neighbor, and otherwise, or like even a destroyed field, and if that strip is going to be separated from his field by even just a small amount, then basically what this is going to be saying, says the Marafulda, is that if you have two adjoining fields from different grains and they're not separated by this required bet rova, the grain has to be uprooted from the border area to give this separation. You have to have enough separation. But the Gemara here is teaching that if in such a case one of the fields was just mostly destroyed, leaving only a small piece of the adjoining area of the other field, then that piece is no longer considered a field. It's just going to be considered a strip. And therefore, you're going to have these separations coming at 2 amos. So we were covering this before. You have a special halachic status when you have this bet sa'ah of area. That's going to be 50 amos by 50 amos. That's the minimum measurement for really counting as like a grain field, right? So what happens if somebody had this 50 amos by 50 amos field, and now most of it's destroyed, there's only a small area left? Well, they're saying that that's not really a field anymore. That destroyed area, that's really just going to be like a strip. And then if it's going to be like a strip, it's going to have the halachic status that you can have a 2 by 2 amos separation between my field and your field. And because this is not really your field anymore, this is just a strip. Now, normally between separations between two fields, you need much greater amount than just 2 amot. But over here, between two strips, it's going to be 2 amot. And what this is trying to teach is that if you have a destroyed field, and so it's really just like a partial area of a field, and it's still planted, that you can now go with this measurement system to make sure that you don't have Kilayim and that you're not mixing, you don't have a mar sign problem. And what's that going to be? It's going to be like a strip. So the Gemara is going to note in the last case that there are other grounds to permit the strip to remain, and the Gemara says that the case is otherwise permitted because it is subject to the rule stated by Rish Lakish in the name of Hiskia that says a Rosh Tor formation that derives from the destruction of the surrounding field is permitted to adjoin a field of a different species. So the term Rosh Tor refers to the corner of one field that protrudes at an angle, and this formation is permitted to touch the adjoining field even if the adjoining field is of a different species. And this leniency applies to any narrow protrusion of a field regardless of the shape, and such a protrusion is dealt with as a Rosh Tor, even if it's not actually the corner of the field. So Rish Lakish is going to be teaching here, says the Marafulda, that if two fields of different species adjoin in violation of the law, and one was destroyed and only a small piece of it remains, that small adjoining piece is going to be considered like a Rosh Tor. And that's going to basically be saying, says the Chazan Ish, that in the present case where the small strip is separated by the adjacent field by 2 amos, that strip is going to be permitted. So the Gemara now is going to look at this measurement of Rabbi Chia the Great for the size of the gaps that they have to be from one another. Now, the Gemara is going to give this different opinion on measuring these gaps. This is going to be the opinion of Rebbe. And Rebbe says that he begins the gaps with a bet rova that's going to be 10.2 amos wide in one place. And then he continually narrows the gaps until they are a width of 3 ground-breaking to amos, which is going to be 2 amos at the end. So the gap that Rebbe has is actually going to be much wider. So Rabbi Hiya the Great was saying the middle part, that middle part has to be 2 amos. It has to be 2 amos by 2 amos, and then it can taper off. Rebbe says it can taper off also, but at the point of where it tapers from strip A to strip B, from strip B to strip C, at the very end of the field on both ends, that the difference has to be 2 amos by 2 amos. That's the width difference. Now, Rabbi Hiya the Great is saying it can taper up to a point. It can even go to fitting a point, and that's going to be satisfied by these Rosh Torah laws, leniencies. But Rebbe is going to be saying that no, the middle area, that's going to be 10.2 amos. It's going to be a bet rova. That's going to be 1/24th of the bet sa'ah. So this gap now is much bigger than 2 amos. It's going to be 10.2 amos. That's going to be the width in one place. And then as it tapers down so that you're maximizing the yield, the maximum distance to keep each strip separated, that, according to Rebbe, is going to be 2 amos by 2 amos. Quite a big difference. So the Gemara now is going to question the opinion of Rebbe. And it says, does Rebbe not accept the ruling of the Mishnah that between one area of grain and the other area of grain, a separation of a complete bet rova, that's going to be a full 10 amos by 10 amos is going to be required. So how does he allow a separation that measures the width of a bet rova at only 1 point? So Rebbe is requiring part of the gap to measure the width of a bet rova, and he's going to basically be treating the strips as the same as a field. Now, if you have a difference between this field and that field, you have to have a difference, you have to have a separation of 10.2 amos. Now, why is it that you're going to be treating these two things like a grain field, separating between 2 grain fields? And why isn't it not going to be, more lenient? So the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say there the Mishnah deals with squares, and the separation between those must be a full bet rova. But here, Rebbe is speaking about strips that separates between those, and they don't need a full bet rova. So basically what this is saying, says the Chazan Ish, and he's basically distinguishing that he's basically saying the Gemara does not distinguish between a large field and a strip. It's only distinguishing, as the Chazan Ish explains that this Gemara is saying, between squares and strips. And that's inferring that not only must a field be separated by a full square bet rova, but even these small strips are legally equivalent to fields in that they're going to be square in shape. And the gaps between such strips also have to be in a bet rova. Now, the tradition that the gaps can narrow after being the width of a bet rova in one place, that's going to be ascribed to Rebbe. And this is implying that the other Tanaim disagree with this position. And at this point, the Gemara is going to assume that the Tanaim, it's going to be the rabbis, are going to hold a more stringent position that Rebbe, that the gaps must be a full square bet rova and only then narrow. So Rabbi Hiya the Great basically maintained the most lenient position, more lenient than Rebbe. And the Gemara now is going to try to establish what the Tanaim argue, and basically they're going to be arguing with Rebbe and also Rabbi Hiya the Great. And the Gemara is going to challenge the suggestion that the Tanaim are, Rabbi Hiya's source, and implicitly suggesting that the Tanaim are going to be more stringent than Rebbe and not going to be more lenient. So basically what this is setting up is that the position of the sage is going to be more strict than either Rabbi Hiya the Great or Rebbe. And the Gemara answers. It says there the Mishnah deals with the squares, and here Rebbe deals with the strips. And the Gemara asks this question about what the Rebbes are saying. It says, do the rabbis who disagree with Rebbe not accept the ruling of our Mishnah that strips require a separation less than that of a field? How could they require a full bet rova space in between the gaps. Now, again, if you have between this grain field and that grain field, the separation is going to be 10.2 amos by 10.2 amos. So that's going to be the size of a bet rova. Again, a bet rova is 1/24th the size of the bet sa'ah. The bet sa'ah is going to be 50 amos by 50 amos. So the question is going to be, how do they hold for that? The Gemara answers. Rabbi Yudin says that the small end of the gap between the strips, according to Rebbe, is equivalent to the beginning of the gaps between the strips. That's going to be the wider part, according to the rabbis. So both Rebbe and the rabbis are holding that the measurements given by our Mishnah for the separation between these strips, and Rebbe is taking it to refer to the narrow end of the gap, and the rabbis are taking it to refer to the wider part. So this is really what the Malokat's about. When we're talking about this position of Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, where is this width? So Rebbe says that this width is going to be at where it tapers off, and that's going to be the difference at the end of the field from strip A to strip B, from strip B to strip C. And that's going to be this narrow part. The rabbis are going to be saying that, no, what we're talking about with this position of Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, it's not talking about the end of the field, it's talking about the middle part of the field. That's going to be the width that we're talking about. So the Gemara is going to tie all of this up, and it's going to wonder, as to the law, when is it not possible to have a gap the size of what we're saying. So Rabbi Lazar asks, and it says, if the field was too small to allow for a gap of the required length, what is the law? And basically he's asking, in such a case, is a shorter gap going to be enough? And so Rabbi Hia the Great, who's going to have the most lenient position, is going to be ruling that the gap must be 2 amos wide for a length of 2 amos in the middle, and that is going to be before it narrows off to a point at the ends of the field. So what Rabbi Lazar is asking, he's saying, if the field itself is less than 2 amos wide, then what? Then what do you do? So the Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to say, let us learn from this brisa that Rabbi Lazar bar Shimon and Abba Yosef ben Chanina, resident of Yanoach, said, in a large field, the gap must be 2 amos wide for the length of 50 amos. So again, this is going to be the standard length field for a bet sa'ah, which is going to be the size field, 50 amos by 50 amos, for a grain field, to have the halachic status of a grain field. But it says, but in a small field, in other words, a field less than 100 amos long, the gap need not be this wide, only along most of the length of the field before beginning to narrow. So the Gemara says, and basically what this Gemara is saying is that the gap is going to be for a small field, and that's going to run the length of the entire field. Okay? And the Gemara says, now if those rabbis cited in the Brisa who prescribed a large measure for the length of the 2 amos gap in a large field, 50 amos, nonetheless did not prescribe a set measure for the length of this gap in a small field, but deemed it sufficient if the 2 amos gap extends for most of the length of the field, then the sages who did not prescribe such a large measure for the length of the gap in a large field and allowed it to extend a mere 2 amos in length, surely not would have prescribed a set measure for the length of the gap in a small field. So, summing this up, says Rabbi Kanievsky, that in a field less than 2 amos wide, the gap must extend the width of 2 amos for the majority of the width of the field, and then begin to narrow. This is actually going to be true of any field less than 4 amos wide, that the gap must be 2 amos wide for most of the width of the field, and then narrow. So basically, this is saying, look, if you have a smaller field, okay, you have to make sure that the gap is going to stay wider for longer. If you have a bigger field, this is where the leniency goes, where it can taper off to a point. And the difference between what the rabbis are saying, look, if you have a bigger field, okay, that you have to make sure that this middle part is going to be the bet rova, okay? The gap between row A, row B, row C, according to the rabbis, is going to be 10.2 amos by 10.2 amos. And then it can taper down and it can go to a much narrower point. Okay, that's the position of the rabbis. And how wide is that gap going to be at where it tapers off to? I think it's going to be 2 amos. But in the smaller field, what they're saying is you can't use that same distinction. In the smaller field, look, they're saying, look, it doesn't have the characteristic of being the minimum size for this bet sa'ah of a field. It doesn't have the quality of having this field. So because it doesn't have that, it doesn't get this leniency. And because it doesn't get this leniency for the smaller field, they're saying that when you're planting strip A, strip B, strip C next to each other, that most of the length of this difference, you have to keep it for most of the field. Okay, you can't narrow it down to a point like you would for a big field because you don't have a standard size field. So this is setting up that if you have this 50 amos by 50 amos bet sa'ah field, which is the standard size, that's when it turns on to have this halachic size, you get this leniency. And if you have less than that amount of land, you don't get this leniency. And that means that when you don't have this leniency, you have a smaller field between these different garden strips, let's say, that you can't taper it down all the way. You have to keep it as very wide between strip A, strip B, and strip C for most of it. So it can narrow a little bit, but not as much as this leniency you get when you have a regular standard bet sa'ah field, which, by the way, as we were seeing before in Masechet Shvius, this 2 bet sa'ah field, which is going to be 50 by 100 amos, corresponds to the size of the temple courtyard. And over here, this is going to correspond to half the size of the temple courtyard. And if you have less than that, you don't get this leniency. Have a great day.